So Grace, I mentioned before that Indigenous peoples and local communities are estimated to hold as much as 65% of the world's land through customary systems, yet only have legally recognized 10% of it. So I think all attendees here in the room would like to know, and it's probably a big question, but how are the UN, governments, civil society, Indigenous peoples working together to address tenure? And how can tenure reform and global efforts such as the UN RED program, designed to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, be mutually reinforcing to the benefit of Indigenous peoples? So Jan started talking about this as well, and I think this would be a nice, you would definitely complement a lot of his comments, but you're also there in the middle of multiple networks, multiple platform building efforts, and you are seeing also the results in country and at the local level. So Grace, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva, and thank you very much for inviting me here as one of the panelists and the opportunity to really share our thoughts on this topic that we have on land rights for climate, forests, biodiversity, and sustainable development. Yes, I would reiterate some of and complement what my other panelists have already said. And yes, maybe before I go to how UN bodies, governments, civil society, and Indigenous peoples have been collaborating, I would like to start by saying that Indigenous peoples is one of the major groups or constituencies under the UN processes, and we have pushed for this recognition as one specific constituency and not to be lumped into the civil society constituency, because we are peoples who are in the land, who own the land and the forests, and we have been surviving in the land and forest for years. So at least for us, we are very clear that we have customary rights to the lands and forests that we have. So we are not only talking of civil rights or whatever is that, but we really assert our customary rights to our lands and forests and all the natural resources within our territories. So having said that, we had been actively engaging in all of the multilateral processes, in the UN processes, such as the CBD, the UNEP, the SDGs, the UNFCCC, of course. And we have been asserting for and reiterating that the human rights-based development framework and approach should be very crucial in all of this development work that we are doing. And yes, we talk of our rights in this, and we have, and gradually, or as what Jon had already shared, most of the UN bodies and even the World Bank have now developed their own Indigenous peoples policies, guidelines, frameworks, FPIC guidelines, land tenure guidelines, all of these things. So all of these are now gradually coming into the frameworks of all these UN bodies, which is adopted by our state parties or our governments. The big gap now is on how this is going to be translated at the national and local level. We have, for example, we have already these agreements, such as the Paris Agreement, which recognizes human rights, including Indigenous peoples' rights, women's rights, intergenerational equity, among others. And of course, we also have some paragraphs that refer to the recognition of the traditional knowledge systems, customary governance systems of Indigenous peoples to be integrated in all climate change actions, both in adaptation and mitigation and also in building resilience. So at the same time, we are supposed to be supporting local communities and indigenous peoples platform to strengthen these traditional knowledge systems and also to have an knowledge exchange platforms on how this had contributed to climate change resilience, adaptation, and mitigation. So also, of course, earlier, under the RED Plus decision, they have adopted the Cancun safeguards, which explicitly says that one of the safeguards is the recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples and noting the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and also recognition of the traditional knowledge in customary governance systems in the forests, as well as the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples and local stakeholders. All of these are there and they are very good. And we have, of course, the indigenous peoples have fought for this, have engaged in lobby work and advocacy work with our governments to adopt all of these things, even under the CBD, which is more advanced already in the recognition of traditional knowledge. All of these were because of the efforts of indigenous peoples, advocacy work, lobby work with our governments. The same thing with other processes. So, having said this, this is already an indication on how indigenous peoples have worked with UN bodies, how they have engaged our governments to adopt these very good policies already and have agreed to it. So now, as I said before, it's now how to translate this into the national implementation and also in the local, subnational and local level. And of course, indigenous peoples as well have initiated their own initiatives to talk with their national governments, especially with those who are supposed to be implementing the CBD, the Convention of the Biodiversity, and then also the Climate Change Paris Agreement and all the other agreements under the climate change. So we have to talk to them on how they will be really implementing all of this. And if our indigenous peoples are not really very strong enough to actively work with the governments, then there is a weakness in that. But again, we are saying that even without the governments, even without the other stakeholders earlier, indigenous peoples had been initiating their own collective rights in relation to their lands and resources, even without those guidelines, even without those policies and also these frameworks that I am saying that had been agreed at the global level. But then, yeah, we still have to work and collaborate with government, civil society, and other stakeholders to really support the implementation of all of this. And to basically, of course, to respect, as said by Yon, we have the rights, but the respect and recognition of these rights is the problem. And in any development initiative in the RED Plus processes or mechanisms, there will be no success on this if there is no human rights perspective. And if we do not prioritize the recognition and fulfillment of land tenure rights and security of indigenous peoples and forest-dependent communities. And this is the more urgent part of this equation. While we have all of these agreements, we have all of this decision, we have all of these guidelines, I think the crucial part is really how to recognize this on the ground and provide these rights, because if we recognize these rights, not provide, because we have, as we have said, we already have these rights, but the recognition and the fulfillment of these rights is really the more crucial thing. And in working with local communities and indigenous peoples communities all over, across all the regions, we have seen that indigenous peoples on their own have always asserted their self-determined development. They have been also working with their governments, like for Kenya, one of our partners was contracted out to really develop the guidelines on FPIC, on the free, prior, and informed consent. And also in other countries, they have been developing how to address and implement the safeguards in relation to REDD+, and all the other things that we are doing, so that little by little collaboration with governments until the local level should all recognize all of these rights that we have and implement it on the ground. So having said this, I think my last point would be, yeah, of course we are also working with governments to put in place some policy changes, policy reforms in recognition of the land tenure rights and among other rights that Indigenous peoples are fighting for. And we are also very much concerned on some of the development projects that governments are implementing, wherein instead of recognizing these rights, the more they are displacing Indigenous peoples from their lands and territories, which is the basis of their own life systems and everything that they have. And this have aggravated in a certain level of course, especially for local communities, Indigenous peoples that had been impacted, they have aggravated the poverty situation that is there, because they don't already have the lands that they have been securing for all these generations, and now they are being displaced, and the more they became impoverished because they don't already have the resources and territories where they are dependent on. So, of course, I would say that, again, I will reiterate that it's a priority to recognize and implement these land tenure rights to ensure the success of any development programs that we have on the ground, including REDD+, as you have mentioned, and all the other programs that is supposed to be implemented to achieve the sustainable development goals and to reduce poverty among Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grace, for sharing your experience with global processes, including REDD+ countries, but also the challenges faced by a lot of Indigenous peoples and local communities, even though there are a lot of ongoing processes and platforms and spaces. As it's been mentioned by a couple of the speakers, the challenge is really taking it from the global level to the national and local level. So the implementation challenge is big.